Imagine this. You are a servant in the apostolic palace on the evening of October 31st, 1501. Your hands tremble as you carry a silver tray of wine through marble corridors that echo with laughter and music. The flickering torchlight casts dancing shadows on frescoes of saints and martyrs, but the sounds coming from the banquet hall ahead have nothing to do with holiness. Through the heavy wooden doors, you hear shouts of encouragement, the clatter of coins, and something else that makes your face flush hot with shame. You push open the door and freeze. 50 women, completely unclothed, crawl on hands and knees across the floor, competing to gather chestnuts scattered by laughing cardinals in crimson robes. Pope Alexander VI himself sits on a raised throne, his jeweled fingers tapping the armrest as he watches with obvious delight. His son, Cesare, and daughter Lucrezia occupy seats of honor, applauding the performers. The Pope leans forward, announcing prizes for the most enthusiastic participants. This is not a nightmare. This is documented history, recorded in meticulous detail by Johannes Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, in his official diary. What you are about to discover will shatter every assumption you ever held about Renaissance religious leadership. Think Renaissance popes were celibate holy men devoted to spiritual matters? Think again. Between 1450 and 1600, the throne of St. Peter became a family business where the Vicar of Christ openly fathered children, poisoned rivals at dinner parties, sold salvation to fund family palaces, and transformed the Vatican into a dynastic empire that would make modern crime families look like amateur operations. These were not occasional scandals or isolated incidents of corruption. This was systematic, generational, and completely normalized within the highest levels of the Catholic Church. The evidence, buried in Vatican archives, diplomatic correspondence, and eyewitness accounts, reveals a level of depravity that historians have spent centuries trying to sanitize. But the documents do not lie, and the truth is far more twisted than any conspiracy theory. The Borgia family did not just influence the papacy, they weaponized it. When Rodrigo Borgia purchased his way to the papal throne in 1492, becoming Pope Alexander VI, he brought with him a worldview where spiritual authority and personal pleasure were inseparable. He had already fathered at least 7 acknowledged children, possibly 10 or more, by various mistresses. Unlike earlier popes who at least pretended to maintain appearances, Alexander celebrated his offspring publicly, appointed them to positions of power, and used Vatican resources to build their fortunes. His son, Cesare, became a cardinal at age 18, not through religious devotion but through raw political calculation. His daughter Lucrezia became one of the most powerful women in Italy through strategic marriages arranged with papal leverage and Vatican gold. But it was the infamous joust of harlots that revealed just how completely Alexander had abandoned any pretense of religious propriety. On that October night in 1501, Burchard recorded the event in clinical detail. The banquet took place in the papal apartments, not some distant villa or hidden location. This was the heart of Christendom, the supposed throne of moral authority for all Catholic faithful. The entertainment involved 50 professional women performing increasingly explicit acts while cardinals, bishops, and papal relatives watched and wagered. Chestnuts were scattered on the floor, and the women competed on hands and knees to collect them while the audience cheered. Then came performances that Burchard described as competitions of vigor and endurance. Pope Alexander himself awarded prizes of fine cloaks and jeweled slippers to those he deemed most successful. His children, Cesare and Lucrezia, served as judges. The matter-of-fact tone in Burchard's account is perhaps most disturbing. He recorded this spectacle alongside routine administrative matters, as if organizing such entertainment were simply another papal duty. The morning after such events, these same men would celebrate Mass, hear confessions, and issue pronouncements on Christian morality. Cardinals who spent the night watching performances that would scandalize modern audiences would wake to administer sacraments and advise the faithful on matters of sin and salvation. The cognitive dissonance was apparently non-existent. They saw no contradiction between their behavior and their holy offices. Power had so thoroughly corrupted them that they believed their positions placed them above the rules they enforced on others. The Vatican was not a church. It was a family enterprise disguised as religious authority. The Borgia papacy established a template that subsequent popes would follow and refine. When Giulio de' Medici became Pope Clement VII in 1523, he brought Florentine sophistication to Vatican corruption. Clement was himself illegitimate, the bastard son of a Medici prince, yet he commanded absolute moral authority over millions of Christians. His approach differed from the Borgias in style, but not substance. Rather than crude spectacles, Clement used art, architecture, and diplomatic marriages to build Medici power. He commissioned works that celebrated his family as semi-divine figures. He funneled church wealth into Medici palaces and banks. Most brazenly, he used his position to legitimize his illegitimate relatives, transforming bastards into dukes through papal decree. Pope Paul III, born Alessandro Farnese, took family advancement to new extremes when he assumed the papacy in 1534. Within months, he made his 14-year-old grandson Alessandro a cardinal. The boy had no theological training, no religious vocation, no qualification beyond being the Pope's relative. Paul did not even pretend this was about spiritual leadership. It was naked nepotism, the transfer of wealth and power through the church hierarchy to ensure family dominance for generations. The cardinal position came with vast income from church lands, administrative authority, and guaranteed influence in papal elections. Young Alessandro would help choose future popes, shaping Catholic doctrine and policy based on Farnese family interests rather than Christian principles. Paul also arranged marriages for his illegitimate children using the full weight of papal diplomatic power. His son, Pier Luigi, became Duke of Parma and Piacenza through papal military intervention. The Vatican treasury funded the campaigns. Church diplomatic channels negotiated the treaties. Papal armies secured the territories. All for one man's illegitimate son. The construction of the massive Palazzo Farnese in Rome, one of the most magnificent Renaissance buildings, was financed primarily through church funds. This was not a church building or monastery. It was a family palace, paid for by the contributions of faithful Christians across Europe who believed their donations supported religious work. The artwork commissioned by Renaissance popes reveals their shamelessness. When Pope Julius II hired Raphael to paint the Vatican apartments, the frescoes included mythological scenes of gods pursuing nymphs, celebrations of pagan sensuality, and allegorical representations of papal glory that bordered on idolatry. These were not tucked away in private chambers. They decorated the official Vatican stanza, rooms where the Pope conducted church business. Visitors to the Vatican, including ambassadors, bishops, and pilgrims, walked through corridors celebrating themes that contradicted everything Christianity supposedly stood for. The Borgia apartments, painted by Pinturicchio, depicted Pope Alexander and his family as saints and heroes in elaborate frescoes that still survive today. Lucrezia Borgia appears as Saint Catherine. Cesare Borgia is portrayed as a noble warrior. The Pope himself features as a figure of divine authority. The artist transformed a crime family into holy icons using church money and papal commission. What you've discovered so far is merely the surface of Renaissance papal corruption. The deeper we go, the more twisted this becomes. If exploring these dark corners of human history feeds your hunger for truth, hit subscribe to continue this journey into the forbidden archives of the past. You're about to learn something that will shatter every assumption about religious authority. The Borgias perfected another tool of papal power that made their corruption possible: poison. Specifically, a compound called cantarella, an arsenic-based powder that dissolved completely in wine and killed within days. An invitation to dine with Pope Alexander or his son Cesare was not an honor, it was a potential death sentence. Cardinals who opposed Borgia policies, who refused marriage alliances, who threatened to expose corruption, who accumulated too much wealth or influence, began dying with suspicious regularity. The symptoms were identical: violent fever, convulsions, and death within 48 to 72 hours. Doctors of the time had no way to detect arsenic poisoning. The Borgias exploited this, turning dinner parties into assassination operations. The mechanism was brutally simple. Pope Alexander would host a banquet for cardinals, serving rich food and abundant wine. The wine, already strong and heavily spiced to mask flavors, would be doctored with cantarella for selected guests. The poison took hours to act, ensuring victims left the dinner apparently healthy. By the time symptoms appeared, they were home, with no obvious connection to the papal banquet. Within days, they would be dead. Their positions would become vacant. Their wealth would revert to the Church, meaning to the Pope. And Alexander would appoint Borgia loyalists as replacements, often selling the positions to the highest bidder. It was a perpetual money-making machine fueled by murder. The death of Cardinal Giovanni Borgia in 1497 shocked Rome. He was the Pope's own nephew, a young man in excellent health. He attended a family dinner, seemed fine, then died suddenly 3 days later with the telltale symptoms of cantarella poisoning. Suspicion immediately fell on Cesare Borgia, who reportedly had conflicts with his cousin over family resources and romantic rivals. But no investigation occurred. The Pope, who could have demanded justice for his nephew's death, remained silent. The message was clear. Even family members were not safe if they threatened Borgia ambitions. Loyalty was everything. Opposition meant death. The most notorious poisoning incident occurred at a dinner party in 1503. Pope Alexander hosted several cardinals, including Cardinal Orsini, a powerful noble who had resisted Borgia policies. The evening proceeded normally with multiple courses and free-flowing wine. Within a week, several attendees were dead, displaying identical symptoms. Cardinal Orsini died in agony, his body racked by convulsions. Contemporary accounts by Venetian ambassadors report that the deaths were widely attributed to poisoning, though no one dared accuse the Pope publicly. The surviving cardinals understood the message perfectly. Cooperation meant survival. Resistance meant joining the dead. The irony of Alexander's own death is almost poetic. In August 1503, the Pope fell suddenly ill with symptoms matching cantarella poisoning. Some historians believe he accidentally consumed wine intended for another victim. Others suggest Cesare poisoned him to seize power. A third theory holds that a cardinal managed to poison both father and son, though Cesare survived. Alexander died within days, his body decomposing so rapidly that it shocked witnesses. His corpse turned black and swollen, barely fitting into the prepared coffin. Some interpreted this as divine punishment for his sins. More likely, it was arsenic doing what arsenic does to human tissue. The Pope, who had murdered dozens with poison, died by the same method, victim of his own weapon. The poisoning program was not limited to enemies. It was strategic corporate restructuring through assassination. When wealthy cardinals died without heirs, their fortunes reverted to the church treasury, which the Pope controlled. Alexander discovered he could manufacture vacancies, seize fortunes, and resell the positions, creating 3 revenue streams from a single poisoning. First, the victim's wealth. Second, the sale of the vacant cardinal position to an ambitious buyer. Third, the ongoing income from church lands attached to that position, which could be redirected to Borgia interests. It was sophisticated financial engineering built on systematic murder. Venetian diplomatic dispatches from 1503 document this process in detail, describing how papal finances improved mysteriously after the deaths of wealthy cardinals. Francesco Guicciardini, one of the most reliable contemporary historians, wrote that the Borgias kept lists of cardinals marked for elimination, ranking them by wealth and political threat. The lists have not survived if they ever existed in writing, but the pattern of deaths speaks for itself. Over 11 years of Alexander's papacy, more than 30 cardinals and high-ranking clergy died under suspicious circumstances. Not all were poisonings, some were convenient accidents or sudden illnesses. But the statistical clustering is impossible to dismiss. Being a wealthy cardinal who opposed the Borgias was one of the most dangerous occupations in Renaissance Italy. The poison dinner party system continued after Alexander's death, though with less frequency. Later, popes learned subtlety. Outright murder attracted too much attention and risked provoking a council or rebellion. But the infrastructure remained. The knowledge of compounds, the networks of poisoners, the understanding that problematic clergy could be removed permanently. It became one more tool in the papal arsenal, deployed sparingly but decisively when needed. The memory of Borgia efficiency kept potential opponents terrified for decades, but systematic murder was only possible because the papacy had become a commercial operation where every office, every blessing, every scrap of spiritual authority was for sale. Pope Innocent VIII, who preceded Alexander, pioneered the industrial-scale sale of cardinal appointments. In 1489, he created 8 new cardinal positions simultaneously. This was not about church administration needs, it was about money. Each appointment sold for approximately 200,000 ducats, generating over 1.6 million ducats in immediate revenue. To put this in perspective, the construction of an entire cathedral might cost 50,000 ducats. Innocent raised enough from one batch of cardinal sales to build 30 cathedrals. The money went to papal relatives, military campaigns, and lavish building projects. The cardinal positions were not just titles. They came with guaranteed income from church-owned estates, legal immunities, voting rights in papal elections, and administrative power over dioceses. Buyers were essentially purchasing shares in the Catholic Church, with dividends paid in perpetuity from the donations of the faithful. The cardinals who purchased their positions expected returns on investment. They exploited their dioceses, selling indulgences, charging fees for sacraments, and extracting wealth from parishes. The corruption cascaded down through every level of church hierarchy. Bishops purchased their positions from cardinals. Parish priests purchased their positions from bishops. At every level, clergy needed to extract enough wealth from believers to pay off their purchase price and generate profit. The youngest cardinal appointments reveal how completely merit had been abandoned. Alfonso d'Este was made a cardinal at age 7. His appointment was later annulled when he chose to become a secular duke instead, showing it was treated as a transferable asset rather than a sacred calling. Ippolito de' Medici was trained from childhood to be a cardinal, receiving his red hat at age 23 after years of grooming. He had no religious vocation. He was installed because the Medici Pope needed to secure family control over the College of Cardinals. When Ippolito later wanted to pursue a military career, marry, and abandon the church, he was effectively trapped by family interests. He died mysteriously at age 25, possibly poisoned by his cousin Duke Cosimo de' Medici, who saw him as a political threat. The economics of cardinal sales are documented in Vatican financial records that survived despite attempts to destroy them. Account books from 1484 to 1492 show line-item entries for cardinal contributions, with amounts specified and payment schedules detailed. This was not corruption hidden in shadows. It was systematic, recorded, and institutionalized. The Church maintained bureaucratic records of its own simony, as if selling spiritual offices were normal business practice. Letters from noble families negotiating prices for cardinal appointments survive in various Italian archives. They read like commercial contracts, discussing terms, payment schedules, and the benefits package included with the position. An estimated 30% of Renaissance cardinals were under age 25 at appointment. These were not young men called by deep religious faith to serve God. These were family placeholders, guaranteeing that Medici, Farnese, Borgia, and other dynasties maintained permanent representation in the body that elected popes and governed the church. When these boy cardinals eventually became old enough to vote in papal conclaves, they voted according to family interests, not spiritual discernment. The College of Cardinals became a family council where Italian dynasties negotiated power-sharing arrangements. The broader implication is staggering. Every major Catholic doctrine, every theological position, every interpretation of Scripture during this period was decided by men who had purchased their positions or been appointed for family connections. The Eucharist, salvation, the nature of sin, the authority of the Pope, the validity of sacraments, all of it was defined by committees of cardinals who had literally bought their way in. The theological foundations of Catholicism that still govern over 1 billion believers today were shaped by simony and nepotism on an industrial scale. Pope Julius II represented a different flavor of corruption. He was less interested in family dynasty building and more obsessed with military conquest and artistic legacy. Julius did not just command armies. He led them personally. In 1511, at age 68, the Vicar of Christ donned full armor and personally directed the siege of Mirandola. Contemporary accounts describe him inspecting fortifications, planning artillery positions, and exposing himself to enemy fire. This was not symbolic leadership. Julius was physically present on active battlefields, commanding troops, making tactical decisions, and celebrating military victories. Michelangelo, who was forced to work for Julius on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, wrote bitter letters complaining that the Pope cared more about warfare than art or religion. Julius's military campaigns were not defensive operations protecting Christian lands. They were wars of conquest to expand papal territories and wealth. He allied with France against Venice, then switched sides to ally with Venice against France. His goal was not justice or Christian unity. It was accumulating power and land for the papacy, meaning for his own legacy. The cost in Christian lives was irrelevant. Papal armies killed thousands of fellow Catholics in battles over territorial control. The Pope, who claimed authority to forgive sins, was deliberately causing sins to be committed on massive scales. But Julius also channeled resources into art that would immortalize his reign. He hired Bramante to completely rebuild St. Peter's Basilica, demolishing the ancient church that had stood for over 1,000 years. He commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He hired Raphael to decorate the Vatican apartments. These projects were magnificent, but they were also wildly expensive. The new St. Peter's construction, begun in 1506, consumed vast amounts of money. To fund it, Julius expanded the sale of indulgences to unprecedented levels. Christians across Europe were told they could reduce time in purgatory for themselves or dead relatives by making contributions to the building fund. This was the direct sale of salvation for cash, with transparent prices for years of purgatory reduction. The practice accelerated under Julius's successors. By 1517, indulgence sales had become so blatant and commercialized that a German monk named Martin Luther wrote 95 theses condemning the practice. Luther's primary complaint was not abstract theology. It was the observable fact that church officials were selling salvation like merchants selling cloth. Salesmen traveled through German territories with price lists, promising specific numbers of years reduced from purgatory based on donation amounts. Families bankrupted themselves buying salvation for dead relatives while watching church officials live in luxury funded by their contributions. The entire system was a fraud. Salvation purchased with money extracted from the poor to pay for palaces and military campaigns that had nothing to do with Christian mission. The Borgia apartments still exist today in the Vatican museums, their frescoes preserved behind glass and velvet ropes. Tourists walk through rooms where Pope Alexander hosted his infamous banquets, where Cesare planned assassinations, where Lucrezia managed correspondence for her father's criminal enterprise. The paintings show the Borgia family as blessed figures, divinely chosen, touched by grace. Lucrezia appears serene and holy. Cesare stands noble and just. Alexander sits enthroned in majesty. The images are lies, propaganda commissioned by criminals to legitimize their theft of Christianity's highest office. But they are beautiful lies, executed by talented artists, still drawing crowds 500 years later. The wedding of Lucrezia Borgia in 1502 consumed 200,000 ducats from the Vatican treasury. This was not church money loosely speaking. It was funds donated by Christians for religious purposes, legally and morally restricted to church work. Alexander simply seized it for his daughter's marriage celebration. The ceremony lasted for days, featuring performers, elaborate banquets, theatrical productions, and distributions of gifts to guests. It was Renaissance Italy's equivalent of a royal wedding, except the bride's father was supposed to be a celibate spiritual leader dedicated to poverty and service. The disconnect between rhetoric and reality was absolute. Alexander preached humility from his throne, while drowning in luxury purchased with money meant for the poor. The systematic transformation of the Vatican into a family palace reached its peak under Paul III. He renovated papal apartments, commissioned art glorifying the Farnese dynasty, and redirected church revenues to family-building projects. The line between church property and family property ceased to exist. What belonged to the Catholic faithful was treated as Farnese inheritance. Paul's grandson, the boy Cardinal Alessandro, grew up in Vatican apartments decorated with frescoes celebrating Farnese glory. He was raised to see the church as his family's possession, a resource to be exploited for dynastic advantage. When he participated in papal conclaves as an adult, voting for new popes, he voted based on which candidates would most benefit Farnese interests. Spirituality never entered the calculation. You came into the story thinking Renaissance popes were just corrupt clergy, and now you leave understanding they built criminal dynasties using the church as their personal empire. This transformation of perspective is exactly why these hidden histories matter. If this journey of discovery has awakened your appetite for truth, subscribing means you'll continue accessing these revelations that textbooks won't teach. Your curiosity about the real human experience deserves to be fed. While others learn sanitized versions, you'll know what really happened in history's most powerful institutions. The Renaissance papacy stands as perhaps the most complete example of institutional corruption in Western history. These were not isolated bad actors. These were systemic practices spanning generations, accepted as normal by everyone involved. Cardinals knew they were buying positions. Popes knew they were fathering children and building family fortunes. Artists knew they were creating propaganda for criminals. Diplomats knew they were negotiating with murderers. Nobody cared. Power justified everything. The ability to command armies, distribute wealth, and shape doctrine made popes untouchable despite behavior that violated every principle they claimed to represent. The Protestant Reformation was not primarily about theology. It was a response to this corruption. When Luther, Calvin, and other reformers rejected papal authority, they were rejecting a system that had demonstrated its complete moral bankruptcy. The Catholic Church's response was not to clean house but to double down, launching the Counter-Reformation that solidified papal power and created even more authoritarian structures. The corruption did not end. It went underground, became more sophisticated, learned from mistakes. But the same impulses that drove Alexander, Julius, and Clement continued to operate through subsequent centuries. The Renaissance popes reveal a truth about power that applies across all times and institutions. When individuals acquire absolute authority with no accountability, corruption follows inevitably. These men were not uniquely evil. They were normal humans placed in positions where their worst impulses faced no constraints. The same dynamics that produced poison dinner parties and boy cardinals and Vatican parties featuring professional entertainers operate today in corporations, governments, and religious institutions where power concentrates without oversight. The names change, but human nature remains constant. We sanitize history because the truth is too uncomfortable. Textbooks mention Renaissance popes had mistresses, as if that captures the magnitude of their corruption. They skip the joust of harlots, the systematic poisonings, the industrial simony, the boy cardinals, the military campaigns led personally by popes in armor. These facts are too disturbing, too damaging to institutional reputations, too revealing about how power actually works. So we get vague references to corruption rather than specific accounts of popes awarding prizes to performers while their children judge competitions. We hear about nepotism rather than detailed descriptions of cardinals purchased like stocks and deployed like assets. The reality is too horrible to acknowledge, so we wrap it in euphemism and move quickly past. But moving past erases the victims. The Christians who donated their limited resources believing they supported God's work, only to fund Borgia family weddings and Farnese palaces. The believers who purchased indulgences thinking they were securing salvation, only to pay for military campaigns and artistic vanity projects. The faithful who trusted their spiritual leaders, never knowing those leaders spent evenings watching performances that would scandalize modern audiences. These victims deserve to have their exploitation acknowledged. Their faith was weaponized against them by men who believed nothing except their own right to power. The physical evidence remains. The Borgia apartments, the Raphael frescoes, the Sistine Chapel ceiling, St. Peter's Basilica itself, rebuilt with money extracted through fraudulent indulgence sales. These monuments to corruption draw millions of visitors annually, most completely unaware of the criminal enterprise that produced them. The beauty obscures the brutality. The art distracts from the exploitation. We admire Michelangelo's genius while forgetting he worked for a pope who personally led military campaigns and forced him to work through threats. We photograph Raphael's frescoes without knowing they were commissioned by murderers to glorify family dynasties built on simony and poison. Renaissance papal corruption did not emerge from nowhere and did not disappear cleanly. It was the culmination of centuries of increasing church worldliness and the foundation for centuries of institutional defensiveness. The papacy had spent the medieval period accumulating wealth and power. The Renaissance represented peak consumption, where restraint vanished completely. The Reformation forced a reckoning, but not real accountability. The Catholic Church never truly confronted what its leadership had become. Instead, it defended papal authority even more aggressively, declared itself infallible, and created mechanisms to suppress future criticism. The corruption continued, just with better public relations. The ultimate lesson is that no institution is immune to corruption when power concentrates without accountability. The men who sat on St. Peter's throne were supposed to be guided by the Holy Spirit, protected by divine authority, constrained by sacred duty. None of it mattered. They fathered children, murdered rivals, sold salvation, built palaces, led armies, and commissioned art celebrating themselves. The highest spiritual office in Western Christianity became a tool for dynastic ambition and personal gratification. If that could happen there, it can happen anywhere, and it has. The Renaissance popes are not anomalies. They are examples of what happens when human nature meets absolute power. The names and institutions change. The story remains the same,